The committee will come to order. We're meeting today to consider 18 pieces of legislation, and I now recognize myself for 3 minutes for an opening statement. Today, the full committee is taking another significant step in our work to protect consumers and the public health, strengthen our economy, secure our infrastructure, and combat climate change. We'll be marking up 18 bills that worked their way through our 5 legislative subcommittees. We'll mark up legislation to make our pipelines safer and more climate resilient. We'll address the tobacco epidemic, improve maternity care, protect Americans from toxic chemicals here at home and scams from abroad. We'll also support American businesses by reauthorizing Brand USA, secure our communications networks, fix our broadband maps, and reauthorize our media laws. Obviously, a big task here today. And I'll speak more on these specific bills later on during the markup, but want to focus on a couple of the bills right now. We're going to begin this morning by marking up legislation to reauthorize the Federal Pipeline Safety Program. This comprehensive bill will help protect people, the environment, and our climate from unsafe pipelines. Despite the progress we've made on pipeline safety over the last 20 years, more needs to be done. This legislation rebalances the law in favor of people and the environment instead of corporations and profits. It also helps protect our climate by reversing the Trump rollback of President Obama's methane rules. For months, we've been working to come to a bipartisan agreement with the Republicans on a reauthorization bill. We twice postponed markups of this legislation in hopes of coming to a bipartisan agreement, but several weeks ago it became clear to me that that was not possible. So this is a bold bill that is necessary to make our pipelines safe and secure, and I would hope it would receive the support it deserves. We'll also consider my legislation to reverse the tobacco epidemic. Congressional action is even more critical now after the president's retreat from his promise to prohibit flavors in tobacco products that are so popular with our youth. The president's reversal was extremely disappointing and demonstrates once again that he cares more about pleasing the special interest than he does about protecting the public health. We must advance this legislation in order to prevent losing another generation to tobacco-related illnesses and premature death. We'll also consider comprehensive legislation to address PFAS contamination. These are persistent toxic chemicals that last forever and spread throughout our water, air, and soil. An aims will be offered to H.R. 535 that will incorporate the text of 11 other PFAS bills that advanced out of the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee in September. And together they offer our communities the tools they need to combat this growing environmental problem. And we'll also finally ban asbestos for good, something the EPA has been trying to do for 40 years. So I commend the leadership of all 5 subcommittees and all my colleagues for their work in getting these bills to the full committee for action today. And with that, I yield back. And I would now recognize Mr. Walden, the ranking member, for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Pallone. Appreciate that. Thanks for holding the markup today. I'm pleased that we've made bipartisan progress on a number of the key policies under consideration. But unfortunately, and I might say unnecessarily, not every bill will be in that category of bipartisanship today. Today, we will consider bipartisan legislation to address broadband mapping, spectrum, and supply chain security. Those are all good pieces of work. All of these bills, which build on our efforts from last Congress, expand broadband access in rural America, secure our communications networks, and ensure proper management of federal spectrum resources. With respect to Stellar reauthorization, as most of you know, I haven't been convinced we even need to reauthorize Stellar. We are, and our staffs have been, working on this issue, but I'm not sure we can find a path forward. However, I'm willing to stay at the table and continue these discussions. On the energy and environment fronts, I appreciate the bipartisan talks that we've had on both asbestos and PFAS. On asbestos, the amendment we're considering vastly improves the original bill, and we should not allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good. I hope that the text we've worked on will address concerns that many people have voiced about asbestos-related diseases. And while there are good bipartisan items in the PFAS package, we still have significant concerns, and we know this package will not make it into law. Let's not politicize this critical environmental issue. Chairman, let's work together on a solution that could actually become law. We'll also mark up a bipartisan solution for the licensing and construction of permanent nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain. I appreciate the Chairman's willingness to move this bill forward. This is something we need to get done. The reauthorization of the Pipeline Safety Program has been a bipartisan priority of Congress and this committee for many years. So it is with great disappointment that the Democrats have abandoned this approach and resorted to political gamesmanship on pipeline safety. It doesn't have to be this way. I cannot support the majority's partisan pipeline bill. We've offered a bipartisan compromise that could become law, so I urge my colleagues in the majority to work with us and reconsider on this issue. Today we'll also mark up reauthorization of Safe Web, which reauthorized the Federal Trade Commission to cooperate with foreign authorities to counter cyber spam, scams, and other attacks from bad actors. And we'll mark up Brand USA. Both of those are in good shape. And I know we've got a number of bills on the health care front as well, especially maternal mortality. And then, of course, we're considering the Reversing the Youth Tobacco Epidemic Act. Members on both sides of the aisle want to act to end the youth vaping epidemic and prevent future tobacco use by children. But I fear this legislation could inadvertently contribute to a growing illicit and deadly market. And those with nicotine addictions, both adults and children, will turn to more dangerous, unregulated products. So I also remain concerned this bill does nothing to address the sale of illegal THC products responsible for the majority of recently reported vaping illnesses. Multiple members on the other side of the aisle said last week they want to work together to combat the marketing and use of these products, and I stand ready to do so. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I know we got a long day, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. Next would recognize, I'm just going by seniority here. If somebody doesn't want to do an opening, tell me. So next is Ms. Eshoo, the chairwoman of the Health Subcommittee. Recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the chairman. These 18 bills are in the landmark category, in my view, because they're going to have a major impact on the lives of the American people. As chair of the Health Subcommittee, I'm particularly proud of the 3 health bills we're going to consider today. The Reversing the Youth Tobacco Epidemic Act takes aim at the leading cause of preventable death and illness in the United States. I think we can make history today by beating back big tobacco and its younger brother, the e-cigarette industry, which for years has tried to addict and sicken our young people. Next, we'll consider 2 bills to address a national shame. The United States is the most dangerous place to give birth in the developed world. For African American women in the United States, it's even more dangerous to give birth. They are 3 times more likely to die from childbirth than white women. This is unacceptable, but it's preventable. The CDC estimates as much as 60% of these deaths could be prevented. Our first maternal health bill will inform healthcare professionals about the best practices to manage a mother's care. It will also improve the quality of care that rural moms receive. Our second bill recognizes that to make real progress, women must be able to get medical care when they need it. I'm particularly disappointed that the 2-week mandatory appointment postpartum is not part of the legislation today. This bipartisan bill will certainly help states provide Medicaid coverage for a year postpartum. I'm also pleased with the work of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, and I'm disappointed that Stella has not been totally agreed to, but I'm hopeful that it will be. I think it's an important bill, and I just hope that we can take that up and pass it. Finally, I'm pleased that the committee is moving forward with legislation to reauthorize our pipeline safety program. In San Mateo County, California, where I reside, 9 years ago there was an explosion in San Bruno, California. People were killed, homes were blown up, and so today's legislation really builds on the important work that's already been done and adds to it, and I'm proud to support it. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, to you and all of the staff on both sides of the aisle for the work that's been put into the 18 bills that we're taking up, and I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we go to Mr. Upton, Ranking Member of the Energy Subcommittee, for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And today we do have a number of bills before us, but I want to focus my comments on the new PHMSA reauthorization bill that was released late Friday night. I got to say that I'm disappointed that it's come to this. The administration is opposed. It doesn't stand a chance in the Senate the way that it is drafted today. And after months of bipartisan negotiations, the majority has decided to go it alone and jam through a partisan bill chock full of riders and carve-outs for special interest groups. I got to say that we had a deal on probably 98% of the bill, and then negotiations stopped. So here's what's at stake, and I think we have a poster behind me, but I think they're going to put it on the screen. Legislation to protect public safety and the environment from pipeline accidents has always been a bipartisan issue, beginning with the Natural Gas Pipeline Safety Act of 1968. For over 20 years, under divided governments, we put our differences aside and passed these bills by voice vote in this committee. The Pipeline Safety Improvement Act of 2002 passed by voice. Pipeline Inspection, Protection, Enforcement, and Safety Act of 06 passed by voice. Pipeline Safety, Regulatory Certainty, and Job Creation Act of 2011 passed by voice. And the Pipes Act of 2016, the most recent authorization, also passed by voice. Abandoning our strong history of bipartisanship is irresponsible and reckless. Lives are at stake, so let's stop playing politics with pipelines. As I've said a good number of times, I have three major priorities for pipeline safety. First, we need to make sure that PHMSA and the states have the resources and the inspectors that they need to do their job. Second, we have to make sure that PHMSA can finish the work that it started and complete the overdue safety regs. And finally, we have to encourage innovation and encourage pipeline operators to share information and learn from their past mistakes. This bill falls short, and I'm afraid that some of the attached riders will in fact paralyze PHMSA's pending rulemakings, encourage backroom sue and settle deals with special interests, and send energy prices, yes, through the roof. We all know that pipelines are the safest, most efficient way to transport the critical fuels that our economy relies on. And today I'm going to offer a substitute amendment that increases PHMSA's budget and strengthens the workforce. While it doesn't have everything that Republicans are asking for to encourage innovation and implement lessons learned from prior accidents, the substitute is the only viable path forward. It is the only bill that is likely to be taken up by the Senate and signed into law. So I would encourage my colleagues here to support the substitute amendment so that we can get the bill back on track, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Upton. Next, recognized for 3 minutes, Mr. Doyle, Chairman of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I won't take near that much time. I just want to say most of the bills coming out of our subcommittee are bills that had unanimous support and bipartisan support. We continue to negotiate on Stella. I want to thank Mr. Latta and Mr. Walden for their efforts and their commitment to continue to see if we can get to an agreement, and that's still a work in progress, but that's all I have to say, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois, a ranking member of the
Environment and
Climate Change Subcommittee is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be as quick as my friend, Mr. Doyle. We have 3 bills coming out of the subcommittee. I appreciate the chairman of the subcommittee. We worked really hard to get, obviously, to 2 bipartisan bills, the Alan Reinstein Ban Asbestos Now Act. We'll do the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, Mr. McNerney's bill, 2699. And we really made a good effort on PFAS. We couldn't get there. I'll explain why when we get to the bill. But I do thank him for the diligence and hard work, and I yield back my time.
Now we go to the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Rush, for 3 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, today's markup presents an opportunity to reaffirm our committee's role in fortifying public health, safety, and the environment. And I'm proud of the Energy and Power Subcommittee's contribution to achieving these objectives, and specifically how the Safer Pipeline Act of 2019 advances this cause. The U.S., Mr. Chairman, has the largest network of energy pipelines in the world. These pipelines crisscross many of our districts, including mine. These systems transport natural gas and hazardous liquids throughout the nation and account for 1/3 of all U.S. methane emissions. Methane is a known contributor to climate change. With these factors in mind, it is essential that the safety of our pipelines match the span of their reach. Since the early 2000s, hundreds of incidents have been submitted to PHMSA, resulting in $1 billion cost to the public, serious environmental damages, and hundreds of unfortunate injuries and even fatalities. Recent pipeline incidents in North Dakota and Massachusetts are crucial reminders of why we need enhanced safety measures for these systems. While I remain firmly committed to establishing a clean energy economy future, immediate safety within our nation's current energy infrastructure is of vital importance. The reauthorization bill we're discussing today takes this into consideration by requiring leak detection technology, improving penalties for reckless operations, preserving Obama-era restrictions on methane emissions, mandating immediate repairs, and other common sense provisions. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the staff for your commitment to this legislation. And I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. Next is Dr. Burgess, Ranking Member, Subcommittee on Health, for 3 minutes.
I thank the chairman for the recognition, and I do appreciate that we have been able to work together on some of the bills before us today, the 2 bills dealing with maternal mortality, which build on the bipartisan success of Representative Jamie Herrera Butler's H.R. 1318, the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act, signed into law in the last Congress. It should be a national goal to eliminate all preventable maternal mortality. Even a single maternal death is too many. The death of a new or expecting mother is a tragic event. It devastates everyone involved. And if there are preventable scenarios, we should avail ourselves of that. One of the bills is H.R. 4996, the Helping Moms Act of 2019, introduced by Robin Kelly and myself. It provides a state option under the Medicaid program to provide for and extend continuous coverage for pregnant and postpartum mothers for 12 months after birth. There's a growing body of evidence that providing Medicaid coverage during the 12 months after delivery is, in fact, beneficial for the health of the mother. The other bipartisan bill on maternal mortality before us today, H.R. 4995, the Maternal Health Quality Improvement Act of 2019, will improve the networks to address gaps in maternity care and maternal morbidity and mortality, particularly in rural areas, by establishing Health Resources and Service Administration grants. I am a co-sponsor of this legislation. I believe it is important in spreading the best practices and innovation in care for pregnant women before, during, and after birth. We also have H.R. 2339 from the Health Subcommittee. This has been labeled the tobacco bill. We have seen a surge in lung injury in the United States. It's an issue that has not adequately addressed in this bill, as the Centers for Disease Control has linked the injuries to black market tetrahydrocannabinol and not nicotine. Protecting our youth from tobacco is an important priority, but 2339 goes too far, and I cannot support it. I hope we can continue the conversation on tobacco, particularly that of raising the age to 21, as many states, such as Texas, have already done. I do look forward to passing these maternal mortality bills out of the Energy and Commerce Committee today. I hope they are soon to appear on the floor of the House, and I hope they make it to the President's desk so we can deliver a win for American mothers. And I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Dr. Burgess. Next, for 3 minutes, Ms. Schakowsky, Chairwoman of the Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee.
Thank you. In our subcommittee, we are reauthorizing legislation to promote inbound travel and tourism to the United States, and legislation to help the Federal Trade Commission protect Americans from fraud that originates overseas. Brand USA was authorized to work directly with the United States tourism and travel industry to maximize the social and economic benefits of travel. The bill we are marking up today was introduced by my friends, Peter Welch and Gus Bilirakis, and I thank them both for their leadership. I'm also pleased that we are reauthorizing out of our subcommittee the United States Safe Web Act. Congress amended the Federal Trade Commission Act in 2006 to bolster the FTC's ability to combat fraud that originates overseas. Doing so strengthens the FTC in four very important ways that are part of this legislation. This bill, which would reauthorize these authorities for another 7 years, was introduced by my friend, colleague, and ranking member, Kathy McMorris Rogers, and I thank her for her leadership on this and her partnership on the subcommittee. So I wanted to acknowledge her leadership, and I'm proud to co-sponsor that. And I am very proud of all the subcommittee chairs for bringing so many important bills to the vote today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Schakowsky. Next, we have Mr. Latta, Ranking Member, Subcommittee on Communications, and I'm sorry, yes, I got that right, for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding today's markup. I'm pleased to see several bipartisan bills for consideration that span across the broad jurisdiction of our committee, from ensuring communities have access to broadband service to providing better health care for pregnant women and new mothers. I'd like to start with the Broadband Data Act. For far too long, rural America has fallen behind in the digital economy due to the lack of broadband access. This bill would help change that and extend the reach of broadband to remote areas like in my own district in Northwest Ohio. I'd like to thank my good friend, the gentleman from Iowa, for working with me on this bipartisan legislation. This is an important step forward to ensure our nation's maps accurately indicate where Americans have internet access and those who do not. We are also considering the SHARE Act, which I introduced with my friend, the chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Pennsylvania. As Congress continues to debate the National Defense Authorization Act, I'm pleased to see the Energy and Commerce Committee take up this bill through regular order. This bill will ensure NTIA is armed with the necessary direction and resources to employ innovative spectrum sharing techniques across the federal government. Another important measure that I've co-sponsored is the Maternal Health Quality Improvement Act, which incorporates language from my own bill, the Rural Moms Act. This bipartisan bill will make important strides toward addressing rural maternity mortality rates across the nation by expanding convenient and consistent access to health care services for pregnant women and new mothers in remote areas. I also intend to offer an amendment today to the Safer Pipeline Act, which would encourage continued innovation in pipeline technologies without sacrificing safety. This amendment will be helpful in updating regulations to reflect advances in technology, as well as encouraging continued investments in research and development. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Latta. Next, we go to Mr. Tonko, Chair of the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding today's markup. I'm very pleased that 3 of the bills being considered were advanced by the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change in September. including H.R. 1603, which would take the long overdue step of banning asbestos in the United States. I want to thank Congresswoman Bonamici and our colleagues on the minority side for working with us on this effort. We have worked to address concerns that have been raised about the original bill while still preserving the goals that have been fought for by a wide range of stakeholders, including workers, firefighters, and families that have suffered from asbestos-related diseases. I hope we can advance this bill on a bipartisan basis today. We will also consider H.R. 2699, the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act of 2019, which was introduced by Congressman McNerney and Ranking Member Shimkus. This bill builds on the work done last year under Mr. Shimkus' leadership when a very similar bill passed this committee at 49-4. We all know nuclear waste issues are challenging, but I'm happy that members are committed to continuing to work to bring about a long-term solution. Finally, we have H.R. 535, introduced by Congresswoman Dingell, for which there will be an amendment in the nature of a substitute to incorporate versions of many of the other dozen PFAS bills considered by this subcommittee in September. Anyone here that represents a community that has been suffering from PFAS knows just how dangerous these contaminations and exposures can be. It is clear there needs to be much greater federal leadership to ensure these substances are being monitored, tested, treated, and cleaned up. At the subcommittee markup, some members suggested that this has become an emotional issue and we need to have policy grounded in science and data. I certainly agree with those concerns. I believe the package we will consider today adopts that science-based approach by allowing EPA to acquire the data necessary to make informed decisions. I look forward to discussing what is in this package and why it represents tremendous progress and compromise in the effort to reduce PFAS risks. I hope we can favorably report all three of these bills. Mr. Chair, I also strongly support the Mapping Accuracy Promotes Services Act and the Broadband Data Act. In the capital region of New York, we know that improving the maps and the challenge process and holding companies responsible for reported service is crucial to everyday life. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Next, we have Ms. Rogers, who was the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Included in today's markup are two bipartisan bills from the Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee. H.R. 3851, led by Mr. Welch and Mr. Bill Rackus, extends the travel promotion program, Brand USA. Brand USA promotes travel to the U.S., bringing tourism to areas like Eastern Washington and spurring economic growth in areas that may not be able to market to foreign tourists. It also does this at zero cost to taxpayers. In fact, Brand USA offers $25 in return on investment for each dollar it spends and brought in over $4 billion in foreign spending in FY18. I'd like to thank Mr. Welch and Mr. Bill Rackus for their leadership on reauthorizing this program and urge my colleagues to support it today. The second CPAC bill is the U.S. Safe Web Extension Act, which I'm leading with Representative Kelly Bouchon and the chairwoman, Jan Schakowsky. The internet has made life-changing innovations possible that have raised our standard of living and connected us with the world. However, it's also created new opportunities for criminal activity, especially from bad actors in countries like Russia and China. To protect Americans, the FTC is our top cop on the beat, both here at home and abroad. The U.S. Safe Web Act is the successful tool that the FTC uses to protect Americans from online threats from overseas, and I'm glad that we're extending it on a bipartisan basis. On a similar note, I'd also encourage support for the bills related to securing our telecommunications supply chain and networks. As we work to beat China in the race to 5G, it's imperative that we remove any security threats from our network infrastructure. Using equipment from companies linked to the Chinese government, such as Huawei or ZTE, would be a grave mistake. It would threaten our national security and weaken America's ability to win in a global economy. I'm pleased that both ENC and the FCC are taking action this week to maintain our leadership and beat China. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. That completes the opening statements by the chairs and the ranking members of the subcommittees that have bills before us today. So now we're just recognize members for 1 minute who would like to be considered based on seniority. Anybody on the top level here? No? Nobody? On the second level, Mr. McNerney's recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Chair for opening for today's markup. Today we're considering a bill that Mr. Shimkus and I introduced, H.R. 2699, the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act of 2019. We introduced this bill because we believe the issue of nuclear waste is urgent. Our country has a dangerous buildup of inadequately secured nuclear waste, which puts communities at risk and prevents us from fully integrating nuclear power into our emissions reducing agenda. If we're to address the climate crisis with the urgency it requires, it's imperative that we act to resolve the nuclear waste issue in a bipartisan manner. Another piece of legislation I'm glad we're taking up is H.R. 4998, the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act. H.R. 4998 incorporates H.R. 4973, which I introduced with my colleague, Mr. Long, which prohibits the use of federal funds for communication equipment that supports that pose a security risk to our nation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney. On the Republican side, anybody on this top level? Anybody at all on the Republican side that wants to speak? No? Democratic side, Mr. Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my colleagues for the work that they've done to bring us here today. I do want to speak with concern to one bill, H.R. 2699, the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act. I'll quote Senator Jeff Bingaman, who correctly said that, quote, interim storage can play an important role in comprehensive waste management program, but only as an integral part of the repository program and not as an alternative to or de facto substitute for permanent disposal. I worry that this bill makes it more likely that a future interim storage site, potentially one in New Mexico, becomes a permanent home for nuclear waste. I want to read a story because it's not just the waste with the nuclear spent rods that need to be cleaned up. There's contamination and cancer inside of people all across America that need our help, directly tied to nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. On July 16th, 1945, my sisters Elena, Addie, TV came home to the family ranch located 5 miles west of Capitan. That July day, they were helping their mother in the ranch house when they heard a loud explosion that shook the house and broke the windows. They huddled in fear in a corner. The letter goes on to talk about their experience in the white dust that encompassed everything, and then Addie goes on to list all of her family that have died from cancer at very young ages. I certainly hope my colleagues will consider the amendments before us so that we're cleaning up all contamination, but not making a permanent repository in New Mexico. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lujan. Anyone on the Republican side? On the Democratic side, Ms. Kelly, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. Currently, we are facing a maternal mortality crisis. 700 to 900 moms are dying each year, yet over half are preventable. H.R. 4996, the Helping Moms Act of 2019, will help to reduce preventable maternal deaths by incentivizing Medicaid coverage for the full year postpartum, which is a critical time period for moms. I am proud that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle came together on this next but not last step to address this crisis. A special shout out to Dr. Burgess. I look forward to continuing my work or to work with my colleagues like Rep. Kennedy who have ideas to improve maternal health. I'd also like to encourage all of my colleagues to support H.R. 4779, the U.S. Safe Web Act. This important reauthorization will allow the FTC to pursue foreign wrongdoers and challenge misleading practices that target American consumers. International coordination has allowed the FTC to target internet pyramid schemes, telemarketing schemes, and child IoT privacy violators. It is vital that the FTC continues working with international partners to protect American families. I want to thank Rep. McMorris Rogers for her leadership on this issue, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Does any other member wish to make a 1 minute opening statement on either side? Okay, then that concludes opening statements. Pursuant to committee rules, members' written opening statements will be made part of the record, and please submit written opening statements to the clerk's desk. At this time, we'll begin bill consideration, and the chair calls up the Safer Pipelines Act of 2019. Now, we don't have a number on this, right? This is the, what is it? Oh, it's HR blank. This was a bill that was introduced last week, but we're now doing it as a committee draft that's been submitted by Mr. Rush. You have that?
I do, sir.
Okay, the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. blank. A bill to amend Title 49 United States Code to provide enhanced safety and environmental protection in pipeline, transportation, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. I'm going to do an opening. All right, I'm going to start with myself. Oh, I'm sorry. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. But I'm going to move to strike the last word and recognize myself for 5 minutes on the bill. The Safer Pipelines Act of 2019 is a strong bill that will make our nation's pipeline network safer and more environmentally friendly. Chairman Rush and I drafted this bill with Transportation Infrastructure Committee Chairman DeFazio. This bill has been endorsed by the Pipeline Safety Trust, NRDC, the Environmental Defense Fund, and the fire chiefs. I understand that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are disappointed that we don't have a bipartisan pipeline safety bill before us today, but I don't think that's for lack of effort. We worked for months with the Republicans in an effort to craft a bipartisan bill. We postponed consideration of the pipeline safety bill at the full committee multiple times so we could have additional time to develop a bipartisan bill. But unfortunately, negotiations reached a standstill when it became clear that my Republican counterparts were unwilling to basically incorporate or really give much on our top priorities, which I made clear from the outset. And those included addressing the unnecessary cost-benefit analysis, requiring automatic or remote control valves or transmission pipelines, regulating the expanding network of gas gathering lines, and fixing the onerous criminal penalty standard in law. These are things that I've been advocating for years. We had a pipeline explosion, I'm going to say 20 years ago, but maybe it was longer, in my district at Durham Woods and Edison. And ever since then, I've been trying to include these things, but we haven't been able to get bipartisan agreement. And I've seen the compromise that my Republican colleagues have introduced, H.R. 4700, but I don't really think that's a compromise. I think it's basically an extension of the current law, which I just don't think is acceptable after so many years of these explosions. Let's just mention recently, the Keystone Pipeline leaked 400,000 gallons of crude oil into farmland and into wetlands. H.R. 4700 wouldn't do anything to prevent explosions like the Dominion Pipeline in Ohio just this past Friday, or the massive explosion in Kentucky that killed one person, hospitalized 5 others, destroyed railroad tracks, and forced the evacuation of dozens of people. There's no doubt that we've made some improvements with pipeline safety over the last 2 decades, but the 1996 rewrite of the law was a huge giveaway, in my opinion, to industry, and that we've been clawing our way back from ever since. So this bill, Mr. Rush's bill, would finally bring the law back to a place where it's truly balanced, giving as much consideration to people and the environment as it does to industry. And we're doing this at a critical time when we're seeing more and more pipelines getting approved and built, regardless of whether they're truly needed and despite potential harm they pose to property owners or sensitive lands and waters. So the Rush bill will also address climate change by minimizing methane leaks from pipelines. It contains language pushed by Representative Peters that would require leak detection technology on pipelines. It also mandates repairs of major pipeline leaks and requires pipeline operators to use the best available technology to capture gas releases during pipeline maintenance. And it includes language authored by Congresswoman DeGette that was restore the Obama administration's methane rule, something that even the BP has called the right thing to do for the planet. I think I'm being reasonable, but I don't want to move backward or stand still. I still hope we can reach an agreement with our Republican colleagues and maybe sit down and work something out as we move to the floor, but I just don't think there's any point right now in not trying to move forward. So today, we're going to pass a progressive bill, and vote to move this bill out of committee. And with that, I would,
Mr.
oh,
Chairman.
I'm sorry. I will yield.
Yeah,
You want my time?
No,
Or you want your own time?
yes.
Does anybody want my time, or you want to wait for your own? Okay. All right, so I'm going to yield back and now yield to our ranking member, Mr. Walden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. For as long as anyone on this committee can remember, pipeline safety has truly been a bipartisan issue. Under Republican majorities, even with divided government, we managed to put our differences aside. We worked together for the common good. Every 4 to 5 years, like clockwork, we got it done. 2002, 2006, 2011, 2016, we got these bills signed into law with strong, unanimous votes every single time until now. Now here we are today, way off track. After months of bipartisan negotiations, with an agreement almost within our grasp, our Democratic colleagues walked away from the table. Democrats are abandoning our strong history of bipartisanship for special interest environmental groups more interested in stalling FSMA's regulatory progress and imposing their own sue and settle agendas. That's what's going on here. The Democratic bill is full of riders and carve-outs for their friends and allies at the expense of everyday working Americans who rely on the fuels and feedstocks delivered by pipelines every single day. Our nation's pipelines safely deliver trillions of cubic feet of natural gas and millions of barrels of liquid petroleum products each year. They are essential. The volumes of energy products they move are well beyond the capacity of other forms of transportation. According to FSMA, it would take a constant line of tanker trucks, about 750 per day, loading up and moving out every 2 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to move the volume of even a modest pipeline. The railroad equivalent of this single pipeline would be a train of 225 28,000-gallon tank cars. We owe it to our constituents to roll up our sleeves and to work together. There's no reason this became partisan. It was not headed down that track until it was. While some on the other side of the aisle would like to live in a fairy tale world where we don't have fossil fuels and we don't have pipelines, we don't believe that's a reality. So, Mr. Chairman, I would urge you to pull back on this. Let's make pipeline safety the bipartisan issue it has been time and time and time again, and can be going forward, because that is what will become law. That I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. Does anyone, recognize Ms. Eshu for 5 minutes, strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word, and thank you for bringing this important bill to reauthorize pipeline safety programs at PHMSA. I said in my opening statement this morning that 9 years ago in the county that I live in, a natural gas pipeline exploded in San Bruno, California. It killed 8 people, it injured 60, and it destroyed 37 homes. The scars in that community live on, as they do in other communities where there have been these explosions. Now, we've made some progress to improve our pipeline safety laws since San Bruno, but PHMSA has been slow, S-L-O-W, to implement the requirements of the laws passed by Congress in 2011 and in 2016. And I have a big problem with that. We did our work, but they have not implemented what we placed into statute. So I think it's critical for Congress to address these delays, because an average of 12 people die every year in pipeline incidents. The bill addresses this problem by removing the duplicative cost-benefit analysis that too often delays PHMSA regulations. The bill also requires pipeline operators to install automatic valves on their lines, and it establishes a more reasonable criminal standard to hold them accountable when they break the law. I think that that's fair. I'm especially pleased that the bill includes a provision I've called for since 2016 to clarify the ability of private citizens to force PHMSA to perform its required duties. In 2012, San Francisco sued PHMSA for failing to enforce pipeline safety standards in the years prior to the San Bruno explosion. The case was dismissed despite the original intent of Congress that citizens be allowed to bring suits to force PHMSA to act. I pushed for language clarifying the ability of private citizens to bring these cases to be included in the 2016 pipeline safety legislation, and when it was not, I joined with Congresswoman Spear, who represents San Bruno, to introduce standalone legislation to restore the mandamus provision. I'm pleased this language is included in today's bill, which will ensure that citizens can require PHMSA to act in order to protect their communities. I think that that's eminently fair. And given the record with PHMSA, I think it's necessary. These and other provisions in the bill will go a long way ensuring that no other community will suffer the same tragedy as the people of San Bruno and so many others, and I yield back.
Will the gentlelady yield?
I'd be happy to.
I appreciate the gentlelady's comments on San Bruno. We all, we heard testimony on this the last number of years. I just want to assure the gentlelady that in our substitute, we too support finishing the rulemaking for the safety, and I appreciated her concern. Like your bill, the Democrat bill, we also increased funds for PHMSA. This needs to be done. It needs to be a priority and something certainly where Republicans and Democrats should be together as it relates to that, as we did with Lois Capps when she was here on the committee, and as we saw with the spill in Michigan, not my district, but others, in terms of changing some of the, not only the technological requirements, but also making sure that spills were reported within 24 hours versus a timely basis, which is somewhat vague. So appreciate the gentlelady's comments. Yield back.
I appreciate the comments of the gentleman, and I yield back.
I thank Chairwoman Eshoo. Anyone else want to strike the last word on either side? On the Republican side now? We'll go then to Ms. DeGette for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I support the legislation, and I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including, as you mentioned in the bill, H.R. 2711, which is a provision I introduced earlier this year as standalone legislation to block the Trump administration's attempt to roll back a key EPA rule that's been helping to curb our nation's methane emissions. Methane is one of the most potent greenhouse gases on the planet. It's 84% more powerful than carbon dioxide, and it's frankly a driving force behind our ongoing climate crisis. Climate experts around the world agree if we're going to be serious about combating the climate crisis, then we have to take steps now to stop the methane emissions. The previous administration did exactly that. Because more than 1/3 of all methane emissions in this country come from the oil and gas industry, the Obama administration in 2016 issued a rule that required all oil and gas rigs across the country to take steps to capture this harmful pollutant instead of just releasing it into the atmosphere. This common sense rule has been both an inexpensive and simple way for the industry to curb its emissions of the highly potent gas. It's been hailed as a success in some of the nation's top oil and gas producing states, like my state of Colorado, where companies have been able to both reduce their methane emissions and also continue to increase their profits at the same time. And it's led some of the nation's largest oil and gas companies to invest millions of dollars in reducing methane emissions. So despite the widespread success of this rule, the current administration is now attempting to roll it back. Why? I don't know, and I don't think we can let that happen. Rolling back the rule would reverse much of the progress the country has made in fighting the climate crisis. It would allow more than 340,000 metric tons of methane and 270 metric tons of other hazardous air pollutions to be released into our atmosphere in just the first 5 years alone. The current administration claims that it's rolling back this rule to save companies money. But that claim has been directly contradicted by some of the largest oil producers themselves. Companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, and BP have all spoken out in support of the EPA regulation of methane. Climate scientists from around the world agree we have to stop the worst effects of the climate crisis, and the U.S. has to take the lead in reducing our emissions of harmful superpollutants like methane. Rules like this are helping us achieve that goal. Reversing them now will just set us back years and only exacerbate the crisis that we should all be working together to solve. So thanks again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairwoman DeGette. Does anyone else want to strike the last word? If not, we're going to move to amendments. All right. So we have Mr. Upton has an amendment, amendment in the nature of a substitute. Do you have that, Madam Clerk? All right. Will you report?
One.
Yes, sir.
You got it. You clerk will report the amendment, the Ains.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. blank offered by Mr. Upton of Michigan.
And without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and I recognize Mr. Upton for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As has been noted earlier today, Republicans have been very clear about our priorities for pipeline safety reauthorization. We need it. We have more than 20 years of history of bipartisanship with pipeline safety on the line. We want to see an increase in funding for PHMSA and the states, and we want to help get more boots on the ground to inspect pipelines and make sure that they are safe in every community. We also want to encourage pipeline operators to innovate, to incorporate new safety technologies, and learn from past mistakes. And I have to say, after months of bipartisan negotiation, we have a different path today. It is, I think, a pretty partisan plan without our input. The bill before us, the underlying bill, is a Christmas tree of riders, carve-outs for special interest, and the administration has noted their opposition to this bill, and it does not stand a chance in the Senate. So let's get something done. This is most unfortunate, given that the underlying bill has always been a bright spot of bipartisanship, even with a divided government like we've seen over the last 20 years. So PHMSA's authorization expired 6 weeks ago, October 1st. And with the bill before us today, we appear further apart than ever before. That's why I'm offering a substitute amendment to get the process back on track. This substitute amendment would provide an increase in funding for PHMSA and increase the number of pipeline safety inspectors in the field. It's the only bill that could pass by voice in committee, and it's the only bill before us today that could pass the Senate and get signed into law. And while this amendment does not address a number of other priorities, it does give us an opportunity to preserve our long history of bipartisanship and keep working until we get to the floor. So I would urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment in the nature of a substitute so that we can actually get a bill to the president and signed into law. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Upton. Anyone, Mr. Rush, Chairman of
I'm going to strike the last
Energy
word.
Subcommittee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, while I appreciate that this issue is deeply important to my friend from Michigan, but in light of the recent Keystone Pipeline leak, which to all of us is most unfortunate, we have a real responsibility to ensure that those pipelines and all pipelines are as safe as they can be, as safe as possible. This amendment, Mr. Chairman, in the nature of a substitute, strikes all text after the enacting clause and inserts H.R. 4700, the Pipeline Safety Act of 2019, a simple reauthorization that includes a direct hiring authority provision. By amending the bill in this fashion, Mr. Chairman, we are missing an important opportunity to authorize PHMSA's use of incentives to get the workforce they need, prescribe technologies to mitigate the impacts of leaks, and require immediate repairs to protect the public and the environment. Mr. Chairman, while I understand why my good friend, is offering this amendment, I strongly urge him to consider what his amendment would do to the safety provisions of the underlying bill. And Mr. Chairman, I welcome the opportunity to work with him to address any of his outstanding concerns. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield just for 1 minute?
Yes.
I just want to make a point that I'm not sure that the underlying bill would have changed what happened with Keystone. And actually, as we look at past examples of where there has been a break, this break with the Keystone Pipeline a couple weeks ago, it was identified in the control room. That's a good thing. In the past, that wouldn't have happened. And in fact, the automatic valves worked. They kicked in within minutes, I'm told, of when they discovered that there was a leak, to really try to minimize the damage that was there. And that was something because of what we have done as a committee on previous bills to require new pipelines to, in fact, have these automatic valves. So it was obviously very unfortunate what happened, but in fact, the system worked the way that it was designed, and we limited the damage. Obviously, PHMSA is going to be doing a full study, a report, within the next number of months to discover the exact cause.
I reclaim my time, Mr. Chairman. I do understand the gentleman and his concerns, but I don't think that what he's attempting to do with this bill will not necessarily protect the American people and provide for the safety that we all sincerely seek to have with our pipelines. And I think that, I will offer my willingness to work with the gentleman to address all of his concerns if he would withdraw his amendment.
Gentleman, yield
Yield
back.
back.
Thank you. Anyone on the Republican side want to speak on the Ains by Mr. Upton? If not, I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. As I said earlier, the Safer Pipelines Act of 2019, the underlying bill, is a strong bill that will make our nation's pipeline network safer and more environmentally friendly. The amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by my friend from Michigan is essentially a restatement of the status quo, in my opinion. And I don't think it's just enough to simply extend the current law. Every day it seems we have new pipelines being pushed for construction by industry, and it's creating more and more backlash from landowners who don't want pipelines running through their backyards, across their parklands, or next to their kids' school. And one of the main reasons for that is that people don't think these pipelines are safe. If we're going to gain public support for new infrastructure like pipelines, then people need to believe that they will be safe and that we'll have strong laws and policies to ensure their safety. I know Mr. Walden said, Democrats don't want pipelines or Democrats don't want fossil. Maybe I went too far.
That may be a little far.
But he sort of suggested that. But I mean, my argument would be that if you want those things, you got to have safety. Otherwise, there's going to continue to be all this opposition. So I don't doubt my friend Mr. Upson's sincerity when he comes to pipeline safety or offering this amendment, but it is essentially an extension of current law with some bells and whistles added. And I just don't think it gives us what we need to reassure the public and to actually make pipelines safer. I share my colleagues' disappointment that we don't have a bipartisan pipeline safety bill before us today, and it's never too late to get agreement, on the floor with the Senate. But we're not willing on our side to move backward or stand still. And as I said, the Upton Ains just doesn't move us forward. So I regret that I have to oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to join me in rejecting Mr. Upton's Ains. And unless somebody wants my time, yes, Mr. McNerney,
I thank the chairman for yielding, and with all due respect for the ranking member of the Energy Subcommittee, his argument is basically, if you want a bipartisan agreement, do it our way. And, I don't see why we wouldn't want to have fugitive emissions captured and Safety Technology Incorporated. I can't imagine why anyone would oppose these policies. With that, I yield back to the chairman.
All right, unless somebody wants Mr. Lujan, you want my time, I yield to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, while I oppose the amendment, support the underlying bill, I wanted just to raise one issue, Mr. Chairman, and I hope this is something that we can tackle, whether it's before we get to final in this particular package or maybe down the road. And it's a matter of reporting. When there's pipeline explosions, when there's leaks, they're not always reported timely. And as we talk about the importance of making sure that miners in proximity to facilities where leaks or explosions take place or where those spills take place, there should be accurate and timely reporting. It should be done within 24 hours of that exposure and that spill. And the one that I was just made aware of, and this is where the concern comes from, is in October 2018, there was a bit of an explosion and a spill in New Mexico, down in Eddy County with an XTO facility, which is Exxon. And it wasn't reported until January of 2019. And then a final report was not made available to the state until September 1st of 2019. Almost a year lapsed before the final report, but even months before it was reported. And so I hope this is something we can talk about. It's a matter of timeliness, transparency, and sharing information. So I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we certainly, I love New Mexico and you, so we certainly will work on that as we move forward. Thanks.
And Mr. Chairman, with this one, I think it was over 400,000 gallons that were part of that particular spill. So thank you.
All right, I think my time's pretty much up, so I'm going to yield back. Does anyone else want to talk about the Ains by Mr. Upton? No? Okay. So let's move forward. We'll proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as presented by Mr. Upton. All those in favor of the Upton amendment in the nature of a substitute will
Recorded vote,
signify.
please. Recorded vote, please.
You want a recorded vote? Okay. A recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute will say aye. Those opposed will say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush?
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Engel? Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor? Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, no. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack, no. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader, no. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Mrs. Stengel? Mrs. Stengel votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey, no. Ms. Custer? Ms. Custer, no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly, no. Ms. Berrigan? Ms. Berrigan, no. Mr. McEachin? Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Blunt-Rochester? Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. O'Halloran? Mr. O'Halloran, no. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. Rogers? Mrs. Rogers, aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Long? Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon, aye. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores, aye. Mrs. Brooks? Mrs. Brooks, aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg, aye. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan, aye. Mr. Giaforte? Mr. Giaforte, aye. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Luis votes no.
Mr. Engel? Ms.
Engel votes.
Rochester, go ahead.
Ms.
Blunt Rochester?
Ms. Rochester votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes?
Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
Anybody else? Who's over there? Castor, Ms. Castor?
Ms. Castor, not recorded, votes. Ms. Castor votes no.
Mr. Cardenas? Anyone else? Oh, we're going to wait a little minute. Mr. Scalise is on his way. Anybody else other than him? We'll wait a couple minutes. Oh, Peter.
Mr. Chairman, we're not going to wait for Scalise on every vote.
I will.
Speaking as his roommate, I object.
Okay.
We have 22 right now, right? And we have, okay, so 30.
Ms. Scalise, how do you vote? Votes aye.
Mr. Scalise votes aye.
All right. And
No, we're on this side, Steve.
unless somebody wants to change their vote, I'll ask the clerk to report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 23 and the nays were 30.
Would you repeat that?
Yes, sir. The yeas were 23 and the nays were 30.
So the nays carry it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to. Are there any other members who want to seek recognition to offer an amendment? Mr. Vesey's recognized. What is your amendment labeled? 20. You have a label, or does the clerk have it?
I have it, Mr. Chairman.
You have it?
Yes, sir.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. blank, offered by Mr. Vesey of Texas, page 11.
Without
strike
objection,
line.
the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would direct PHMSA to find appropriate methods of assessing the integrity of transmission pipelines, including methods like direct assessment, internal inspection devices, and pressure testing. I agree with Chairman Pallone's interest in the development of innovative pipeline inspection methodologies like in-line testing, also known as pigging and pressure testing. While these technologically advanced methods hold a lot of promise, we can agree that they may not be appropriate for every situation. At times, direct assessment of the pipeline by trained and certified inspectors may be the safest and most ideal way of ensuring integrity of the system. It's critical to public safety that inspectors have every inspection methodology available to them, including direct assessment, inline pressuring, and are able to utilize the inspection methods that are right for a particular segment of the pipe. There have also been concerns raised that language in the bill will lead to a one-size-fits-all rule from PHMSA that will give that will not give inspectors flexibility to utilize various inspection methods. My amendment will clarify that the rulemaking is on prioritizing the development of newer inspection methodologies while preserving the safest and most appropriate techniques. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Vesey. Now, I believe everybody's willing to accept this amendment on both sides. Is that accurate? Okay. So we still have to do a voice vote. If there's no further debate, all those in favor of the Vesey amendment will signify by saying aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Do we have any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Latta has an amendment. 19 is the amendment, Madam Clerk. See if you have it. Okay, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. blank offered by Mr. Latta of Ohio. Add at the end the
Without
following.
objection, the reading of the Latta amendment will be dispensed with, and the gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and strike the last word. My amendment would accomplish two objectives. First, it would establish a working group to foster the development of new technologies that would enable FIMSA to update pipeline safety regulatory requirements. And second, it would direct the Secretary of Transportation to establish a pilot program to evaluate innovative safety technologies and practices for the operation of a gas pipeline facility or a hazardous liquid pipeline facility. The goal of this amendment is to bring together all the voices with a stake in pipelines, both public and private, to advance innovation without sacrificing safety. Every year, the private sector makes technological advances that would allow for the delivery of energy in more efficient, reliable, and environmentally friendly ways. Unfortunately, a lack of flexibility in the regulations has prevented vendors and pipeline operators from being able to incorporate and benefit from these developments within their safety programs. This amendment changes that. At the same time, I believe we must never sacrifice safety. Whether it is during discussions over pipelines or autonomous vehicles, I have constantly and consistently said, safety first, safety last, safety always. That is why in order to qualify for exemptions for regulations under my amendment's Innovative Pipeline Safety Pilot Program, the Secretary would require that the safety measures in the programs achieve a level of safety that is equivalent to or greater than the level of safety that would otherwise be achieved through compliance with the regulations. A vote for this amendment would be a vote for both safety and innovation, and I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time and urge the support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Latta. I recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition. While a pilot program to encourage innovation sounds like a good idea on the surface, I can't support allowing pipelines to test new technologies in the field unless they know it works and it's safe. So we shouldn't allow pipelines to be exempt from regulations that are meant to protect our communities. And the amendment, from what I can see, allows an unlimited number of exemptions. However, I would say to Mr. Latta, if you were willing to limit the scope and duration and raise the standard for qualifying for the pilot, I think we could work this out, maybe even today, if not, before we go to the floor. Basically, I wanted, some guardrails. So if you're willing to withdraw it at this time, we could try to figure this out before final passage, or if not, before we go to the floor. I'm just trying to...
Would the gentleman yield? Would the chairman yield?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe if, I'm just saying, knowing that your side has the votes and we don't, maybe if we did a unanimous consent request that we just strike a couple words here. I'm looking at page...
What are you looking at?
I'm looking at page 4 of the amendment, line 18, where it says safety approved under subsection B if the safety technologies and practices included in such innovative safety programs are designed to achieve a level of safety that is equivalent to or greater than. What about if we just struck is equivalent to, so that we say to achieve a level of safety greater than the level of safety that would otherwise be achieved? So we take out the equivalent, but if in essence, by saying if the safety requirements are greater than the current standard, that would be acceptable. And we would strike the equivalent, just strike really 2 words, that is.
Well, why don't you give
3
us
words.
a little time here to look at what you're suggesting and the other things that I said and see if we can work this out.
3 words, strike equivalent to or.
Okay. Well, Mr. Laddick, willing to do that, or you want to work a little further?
Can I make a unanimous consent request that we would strike equivalent to or on line 21 on page 4?
All right, but I'm not sure that that's not good enough. We might want a little more time. You want-
Right, why doesn't the
Why
gentleman
don't we try
withdraw
to,
for the
why don't we
moment?
just withdraw this now, and let's see if in the next few minutes or so.
And speaking, and, with the ranker and also with
Wait a
chairman,
minute, the gentleman, I yield to
If we
Mr.
could,
Ladd, I can't hear you. What'd you say?
informally passed right now, but then have it retain its place on the calendar for an amendment, then I would say we could work it.
No, I'm just saying withdraw it for now, and we'll try to figure this out in the next few minutes. Right.
All right, that's fine.
Okay. All right, so the gentleman's withdrawing this, but he can bring it back before we,
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would withdraw to bring it back.
thank you, and before we go to final. See if you can work this out to the staff in the meantime. All right. Try to do it before we go to final. That's the goal here. All right, so do we have any other amendments? We'll go to Mr. Kennedy's amendment. What's it labeled?
ECJ 01.
Clerk have that one? Yeah, take a minute.
Is this Kennedy's?
Kennedy. Clerk, report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. Blank, offered by Mr. Kennedy of Massachusetts, at the end of Section 3.
Without
add the
objection, the
following.
reading of the Kennedy amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As this committee knows well, 13 months ago, communities across the Merrimack Valley in Massachusetts were thrust into chaos, uncertainty, and the national spotlight through no fault of their own and a tragic accident. At least 131 structures were destroyed, dozens of reported injuries, and tragically, the death of Lionel Rondon, an 18-year-old young man. All because a high-pressure natural gas was released into a low-pressure gas distribution system. A National Transportation Safety Board report identified both the cause of the explosions as well as subsequent recommendations to prevent future similar incidents. What happened in Massachusetts could have been prevented with better oversight, tougher regulations, real accountability, and a more nimble response. Along with my Massachusetts colleagues in the House, Lori Trahan and Seth Moulton, we introduced the Lionel Rondon Pipeline Safety Act. That legislation built upon the recommendations identified by the NTSB. My amendment today would insert many of those provisions into the Safer Pipelines Act of 2019, but I'd like to focus on just 3 in particular. First, as we later learned about the work going on in the Merrimack Valley, unfortunately, the work plans were not properly approved to the standards of a professionally licensed engineer. The NTSB highlighted this fact in its report. My amendment would require that before the construction of a distribution pipeline begins, the plans must be approved by a professional engineer. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts has corrected this loophole. It's time that the federal government follow suit. Second, this amendment would improve pipeline safety practices by mandating improvements to prevent the kinds of oversights that led to the Merrimack Valley gas explosions. In that case, a gas pressure sensor line was not noted in the work package. As the NTSB flagged, complete pipeline mapping information was not available in one spot when the project was being designed. It took far too long for the gas company to identify the source of overpressurization, let alone cut it off. This amendment would mandate complete and traceable records, including maps, to help pipeline operators holistically manage pipeline safety and performance. It would also require regulators to develop a system to evaluate the effectiveness of a pipeline safety management system, including independent third-party evaluators if necessary. Finally, this amendment would add critical language to improve emergency response plans. In the moments, hours, days, and months following the Merrimack Valley explosions, one continuous concern was the lack of the information about what was happening, why it was happening, and when it would stop. The language in this amendment would require better communication from pipeline companies to both first responders and the public. This amendment would mandate new emergency response communication protocol to ensure that our firefighters, police, and EMTs have the information they need when they need it. It would also mandate a voluntary opt-in for consumers to be alerted for emergencies. Mr. Chairman, the underlying bill makes a number of significant changes to improve regulatory oversight of the countless transmission and distribution systems across our country. I want to thank you and the commitment from your staff in working with me on this issue. I know it's been a long one. I also want to thank Representative Lori Trahan for her leadership on this back home, and my colleague Seth Moulton as well, for partnering on the Lionel Rondon Pipeline Safety Act. I urge my colleagues to support this critical amendment, and I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will.
I just want to say to the gentleman, all of us, when we heard and saw the footage on the Merrimack Valley gas explosion, we knew that it was an immediate tragedy, and there are a number of lessons that we need to learn as we have taken that effort on other pipeline explosions. I know that PHMSA has been working diligently to update its regs to ensure accidents like this can't happen in other cities where similar types of gas distribution systems are installed. It's so important to have better communication, which gentleman addresses. May not be a perfect amendment that we would write over here on this side, but I think we're making progress. And knowing that we'll continue to work with the gentleman as it goes to conference to make some improvements on this, we look forward to do that, but we're prepared to let it go by voice.
Thank you. I thank the ranking member.
Gentleman from Massachusetts yields back. Does anyone else want to come? Oh, yes, the gentlewoman from New Hampshire is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to strike the last word. I want to thank you for including pipeline safety legislation in today's markup and the Kennedy Amendment. I support this bill, which would reauthorize critical funding for the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Importantly, this bill includes several provisions that would improve public safety and prevent tragedies like the one that occurred in September of 2018 in Lawrence, Andover, and North Andover, Massachusetts, just across the border from my district. The Merrimack Valley pipeline explosion resulted from excess pressure in gas pipelines that destroyed over 130 structures, displaced thousands of people from their homes, injured more than 20 individuals, and sadly caused the death of one person. This tragedy could have been completely avoided if additional safeguards had been in place. And I'm proud to co-sponsor Congresswoman Lori Trahan's bill, the Lionel Rondon Safety Act, which is partially included in the bill that we're voting on today. The Safer Pipelines Act requires pipeline operators to install automatic or remote shutoff valves for liquid and gas pipelines located in high consequence areas. The use of this technology would help prevent future tragedies from happening. Additionally, the Safer Pipelines Act bolsters PHMSA's enforcement rules for increasing the agency's civil penalty authority to hold bad actors accountable for knowingly and recklessly skirting public safety. This bill is a step in the right direction to keep our communities safe from future tragedies, and I urge my colleagues to support its passage. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Does anyone else want to speak on the Kennedy Amendment? If not, we'll proceed to a vote. All those in favor of the Kennedy Amendment will signify by saying aye. All those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments on either side, on the Republican side?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to desk.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to what we are calling H.R. blank, and it's amendment number 20.
Clerk have it.
We have it, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the Flores amendment.
Amendment to H.R. blank offered by Mr. Flores of Texas. Add at the end the
Without
following.
objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment works on 2 levels. First of all, it establishes a community engagement working group within the Department of Transportation to consider and provide critical pipeline safety recommendations. And secondly, it strengthens common sense penalties against the use of a firearm to damage a pipeline under construction. The working group would be made up of federal, state, local, and tribal officials, together with advocates and representatives for public safety, environmental, and labor groups. Having fair representation from all stakeholders would uniquely position this group to address pressing community issues for pipeline safety and make recommendations directly to the Secretary of Transportation. Also, this amendment makes specific protections for the right to free speech and to no way abridges an individual's right to peacefully protest. We should all agree that dangerous and reckless behavior like shooting a pipeline is not equivalent to free speech. This reckless behavior is directly an issue of community safety and environmental concern. We have heard support for pipeline safety from important stakeholders already. Summer provisions were included in PHMSA's reauthorization proposal. All 4 witnesses at our legislative hearing in June on pipeline safety agreed that the issue of safety is a strong concern. And lastly, 4 labor groups wrote to Chairman Rush and Leader Upton to close loopholes to protect pipeline infrastructure from attack. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is a common sense policy. Damaging pipeline infrastructure can put the lives of workers at risk, lead to catastrophic accidents in surrounding communities, and damage the environment. Reckless use of a firearm to damage pipeline infrastructure should not be tolerated. As you can see in the photo display of related incidents on the screens of damaging pipelines, Congress needs to act. Over the past few years, several high-profile attacks demonstrate increased safety hazard and need for targeted legislation to combat bad actors. Only earlier this year, in fact, a pipeline in Minnesota was shot with a firearm that allowed 8,000 gallons of diesel fuel to leak out, endangering a community and the environment. Mr. Chairman, during our subcommittee markup, I offered and later withdrew a similar amendment to protect against bad actors that are endangering the lives of safety workers and endangering the lives of safety workers and the surrounding environment by damaging pipelines. While my colleagues on the other side offered supportive comments to work with us on these sensible provisions, that discussion ultimately fell through among a partisan approach and without Republican input to develop the bill that we have today. So let me close with 2 final points. First, while I'm disappointed that the majority abandoned our strong history of bipartisan collaboration on pipeline safety, I hope my colleagues will consider these amendments to improve the community engagement on pipelines community. Second, terroristic activities like using a firearm against pipelines are not free speech. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Flores, I'm prepared to accept your amendment. So unless anyone wants to talk more, we'll proceed to a voice vote. All right? All right. Let's see what we got here. We're voting on the Flores amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Flores amendment is agreed to. Do we have further amendments? Mr. Schrader?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The amendment?
Yes, sir.
Report the amendment, please.
Amendment to H.R. blank offered by Mr. Schrader of Oregon. Page 17,
Without
line
objection, the reading of the Schrader amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would make a minor change to the underlying bill that would remove some of the ambiguity in the criminal penalty standard while strengthening the existing statute to ensure bad actors are held accountable. Expanding the criminal penalty standard from knowingly and willfully to knowingly or recklessly would remove the need to prove intentional wrongdoing. And this, in my opinion, would put the system at risk. Comprehensive risk management is at the heart of safety management systems that are being encouraged by the NTSB and PHMSA. In testimony before this committee, we've heard from operators that pipeline safety regulations and programs require them to assess the risk to their pipeline systems and then perform preventative maintenance based on a prioritization of risk. We also heard about the importance of fostering a culture of self-disclosure and self-reporting that is an important part of enhancing safety in the pipeline industry. It's fundamental to comprehensive risk management. I think we need to be very careful we don't create a situation where we end up discouraging pipeline operators from openly sharing information about incidents. If we inadvertently criminalize good faith efforts made by operators to identify, assess, and manage pipeline risk priorities, we put this system at risk. I believe if we're going to hold somebody criminally responsible for their conduct, we need to prove those actions or lack thereof was intentional. I feel my amendment accomplishes this by removing an ambiguous legal standard and strengthening the law to hold those who engage in intentional misconduct accountable and ensures compliance with the law. And with that, I thank the chairman. I urge the committee to support the amendment and yield back.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to speak? All right, we'll proceed to a vote on the Schrader Amendment. All those in favor of the Schrader Amendment will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. The opinion of the chair is the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Do we have any further amendments? Mr. Wahlberg is recognized. I'm sorry, Mr. Wahlberg, how's it labeled?
It's labeled amendment to blank.
Do we have that one, Madam Clerk?
Yes.
It's number 8. All right, would the clerk report the amendment?
Amendment to H.R. Blank offered by Mr. Wahlberg of Michigan. Add at the
Without
end.
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would help improve the underlying bill, I believe, by authorizing a voluntary information sharing system to encourage collaboration among PHMSA and pipeline operators. In the committee's 2016 reauthorization efforts, the committee directed the Secretary to establish a working group of operators, technical experts, safety advocates, and others to consider the need for an information sharing system. After nearly 3 years of discussion and debate, that working group issued a favorable report that made several recommendations to Congress, including the following. 1, Congress should authorize a voluntary information sharing system and direct PHMSA to establish a governance structure and technology platform. 2, Congress should enact legislation to provide confidentiality and liability protections to incentivize industry participation. And 3, Congress should ensure that the VIS program include gas distribution systems data in order to significantly reduce industry incidents nationwide. My amendment would implement the VIS program according to the working group's recommendations. At a subcommittee on energy legislative hearing on the majority's pipeline safety reauthorization discussion draft, witnesses testified that Congress should direct PHMSA to establish this program, provide PHMSA and operators robust protections for information sharing, and facilitate voluntary self-reporting. Let me reiterate that these recommendations by the working group are not only broadly approved by industry and safety experts, but they also came from a working group that was appointed by the Obama administration. In a subcommittee on energy markup held on June 26th, my colleagues on the other side expressed concerns with some of the recommendations, yet committed to working with me toward an agreement before full committee markup. Well, here we are 5 months later in a full committee markup, and my colleagues in the majority seem less concerned about coming to an agreement to instituting this vitally important legislation. Mr. Chairman, I would like to point to the photo behind me, which illustrates the kind of accidents that could be prevented by a VIS system. Industry has shown a willingness to come forward and work with PHMSA in helping prevent failures of the past. It makes no sense why the majority remain opposed to a VIS system and the recommendations made by the working group. After all, they are recommendations supported by Democrat and Republican administrations. I urge you to adopt this amendment and let PHMSA and industry get to work to prevent as many of the events highlighted behind me and on the screen as possible. I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back.
To thank the gentleman from Michigan, I recognize myself to speak in opposition to his amendment. The amendment would limit information sharing and FOIA requests, and I don't think the public should be cut out of the pipeline safety discussions, or should not be cut out of the pipeline safety discussions. The Wahlberg Amendment also protects pipelines from liability if they report on issues related to facility safety, inspections, and risk analysis, and I don't think we should be creating a safe harbor provision for pipelines. So unless someone else wants my time, I'll yield back. Does anyone else want to speak on the Wahlberg Amendment on either side? If not, we'll go to a vote.
Could I request a record vote?
Does the gentleman seek a recorded vote?
I do.
Yes, okay.
Thank you.
Then we'll proceed to a recorded vote as ordered. Those in favor of the Wahlberg Amendment will say aye. Those opposed will say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush? No. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo? Mr. Engel? Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Ms. Castor? Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, no. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader, no. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Mrs. Dingell? Ms. Dingell votes no. Mr. Vesey? Ms. Cusser? Ms. Cusser votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Berrigan? Mr. McEachin? Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Blunt Rochester? Ms. Blunt Rochester votes no. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. O'Halloran? Mr. O'Halloran, no. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta, aye. Mrs. Rogers? Mrs. Rogers, aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long? Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon, aye. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores, aye. Mrs. Brooks? Mrs. Brooks, aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson, aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan, aye. Mr. Giaforte. Mr. Giaforte, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
Ms. Eshoo?
Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel.
Mr. Engel?
Mr. Engel votes no. Mr.
Mr.
Vesey.
What's wrong?
Mr. Vesey votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no.
How was that fly recorded?
Is that a fly? I'm hoping it's only a fly. I don't know what that is. Ms. Eshoo, do we have you recorded?
Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no.
All right, calm down. It's only an insect. Mr. Cardenas? Is Mr. Cardenas recorded?
Mr. Cardenas is recorded, Mr.
Okay. Anyone else who wishes to be recorded on either side? Oh, Ms. Eshoo is asking if she's recorded?
She is recorded as voting no.
As a no, okay. Mr. Scalise, he's on the way back or not? He's in the horseshoe. Okay, we'll
He's
wait.
bringing a fly swatter.
Maybe we can kill the insect in the meantime. Is Mr. Vesey recorded? Mr. Vesey recorded, Sharon?
Let's see. Mr. Vesey is recorded as voting no.
Okay, Mr. Scalise?
Mr. Scalise votes aye.
Anyone else who's not recorded?
I would just note that that fly is over on the Senate side.
You're sending the fly to the Senate? Is that
No,
what you're
the,
saying?
the fly is, it's on the Senate side.
Oh, it's on the Senate side, okay. All right, I think we're done. Does any other member wish to record or change? If not, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 22 and the nays were 29.
And so the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the legislation? Mr. O'Halloran is recognized. Does the clerk, what is your label? What's it labeled? 05? Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. blank offered by Mr. O'Halloran of Arizona. Page.
Without objection, the reading of the O'Halloran amendment will be dispensed with, and the gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is straightforward. The National Pipeline Mapping System is a comprehensive data set for safety audits and regulatory checks on gas and liquids transmissions pipes that span nationwide. We must focus on measures that truly move us forward in promoting pipeline safety in a meaningful manner that also promotes resilience and environmental protection. For the National Pipeline Mapping System, we must ensure it has location data that PHMSA and state safety regulators can quickly interpret and make decisions on how to evaluate transmission pipelines' condition and integrity. My amendment to the base text simply clarifies that location information provided to the National Pipeline Mapping System does not include distribution pipelines such as small lines that serve residential homes. Including these distribution lines would stray away from the system's original intent for use by federal and state safety regulators. This legislative fix would also ensure that the mapping system focuses on compiling location data only for the most critical transmission lines that traverse the country as it was originally intended. It will also ensure that an estimated 2.5 million miles of small residential distribution lines do not overwhelm the national pipeline mapping system, and burden local distribution companies, especially small companies serving rural residential communities. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will.
Our side is certainly prepared to support this amendment. We're glad that you looked through it carefully as we did, and so we appreciate the amendment and we'll support it.
Thank you. I'll take back my time and yield.
Thank you, and unless someone else wants to speak, we're going to move the O'Halloran amendment. All those in favor of the O'Halloran amendment will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Do we have any further amendments on the Republican side? Mr. Bouchon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. It's number 10.
Clerk have that. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. blank offered by Mr. Bouchon of Indiana. Page 17 after line 2, insert the following.
And without objection, well, I guess she's already read the amendment, so the gentleman, Mr. Bouchon, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on the National Pipeline Mapping System, there are over 9,232 miles of pipeline in Indiana. We must ensure that we maintain the safe operations of these pipelines, not only in Indiana, but across the nation. PHMSA's rulemaking process serves as an important tool to ensure pipeline safety operations and provides an opportunity for all Hoosiers to comment and participate in the rulemaking process. Unfortunately, due to limited resources, PHMSA's rulemaking is at times delayed. Instead of addressing these issues, the underlying bill would only exacerbate the problem. The so-called mandamus clause would slow the pace of PHMSA's rulemaking by encouraging frivolous lawsuits, diverting desperately needed resources from higher priorities. The mandamus clause would also deny the public an opportunity to participate in the rulemaking process, allowing the courts, instead of hardworking Hoosiers, to decide the impacts of a regulation. My amendment seeks to protect transparency and public participation. It states that the Secretary shall not enter into any consent decree or settlement agreement that exceeds the authority provided by Congress or fails to provide for transparent public participation. My amendment doesn't change the base bill in any way. It only provides a savings clause to ensure that all in the public have the right to participate in the rulemaking process. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting my amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
I'll recognize myself for... Does Ms. Eshu want to speak on this? I'll recognize Ms. Eshu for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word. I oppose this amendment, which strikes the mandamus provision of the bill. As I said earlier this morning, in 2012, San Francisco brought a lawsuit against PHMSA for failing to adequately enforce pipeline safety standards in the years leading up to the San Bruno explosion in 2010. In 2015, the Ninth Circuit ruled that the Pipeline Safety Act does not allow for citizen lawsuits that require the agency to perform non-discretionary responsibilities. In response to that decision, Congresswoman Spear and myself introduced the PHMSA Accountability Act, which restores the original intent of Congress to allow these lawsuits. Congress intended the Pipeline Safety Act's private right of action to include mandamus-type lawsuits. It was not until the court decision in 2015 that we learned that this was not the case. Our bill is identical to the language that the gentleman's amendment strikes from the bill. As my colleagues know, PHMSA has been slow, extraordinarily slow, to implement the mandates imposed by Congress in 2011 and in 2016. And I don't think Congress should allow PHMSA to wait until the next San Bruno or Merrimack Valley to act. Citizens' lawsuits are an important tool for communities to hold PHMSA accountable and enforce the laws that Congress has passed. I just might add an observation. I would think that Republicans would be on the side that I'm on, given an agency that is not carrying out what Congress's intent is. I mean, you usually go after the bureaucracy when they're not operating the way they should. So this is an important tool. We don't know whether it'll be exercised, but I think that it's an important tool because the agency has not performed. They have really given Congress the freeway salute, and more than once on this. So that's why I have offered what I have offered, and it's why I oppose this amendment. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Anybody on the Republican side want to speak on this? If not, I'm going to strike. The provision in the underlying bill does not encourage, contrary to what some may believe, a sue and settle system, but instead empowers private citizens to demand that PHMSA do its job by taking legal action. The Democratic members of this committee believe that individuals should be able to seek a court order to require the administration to fulfill its duties as required by law. And as Ms. Eshu said, the agency hasn't performed. The administration has a long and consistent record of failing to carry out its mandated responsibilities, and the Safer Pipeline Act, underlying bill, provides real solutions for moving the process forward. So that's why I oppose Mr. Bouchon's amendment, because it severely undermines the mandamus provision in the bill. If anyone wants my time, otherwise I yield back. Does anyone else want to speak on the Bouchon amendment on either side? If not, we'll proceed to a vote.
Mr. Chairman, I'm asking for a recorded vote.
You want a recorded vote? Okay. Thank you. Recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Those opposed to the Bouchon amendment will say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush? No. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshu? Ms. Eshu votes no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, no. Ms. DeGette? Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, no. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack, no. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters, no. Mrs. Dingell? Mrs. Dingell votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mrs. Custer? Ms. Custer votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Berrigan? Mr. McEachin? Mr. McEachin, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester? Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto, no. Mr. O'Halloran? Mr. O'Halloran, no. Mr. Walden? Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Scalise? Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta, aye. Mrs. Rogers? Mrs. Rogers, aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Long? Mr. Long, aye. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon, aye. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores, aye. Mrs. Rogers? Present? I'm sorry. Mrs. Brooks? I thought you were telling me a new vote. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen? Yes, sir. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson, aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg, aye. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan, aye. Mr. Giaforte? Mr. Giaforte, aye. Mr. Gett? Mr. Gett votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes?
Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
Ms. Berrigan?
Ms. Berrigan votes no.
Any other member who's, oh, myself, you don't have me recorded, I'm
Sorry,
a no.
Mr. Chairman.
Votes
Mr.
no.
Pallone
Votes no.
Votes no. Thank you.
Other members, Mr. Cardenas?
Mr. Cardenas votes no.
Any?
Not recorded,
Walden?
Mr. Chairman.
Walden votes aye.
Mr. Walden votes aye.
Any, Mr. Burgess, you recorded? Mr. Burgess?
Mr. Burgess votes aye.
Anyone else we're expecting? Mr. Scalise, or no, he's not coming? Coming on? Mr. Scalise is on his way? All right. Anybody else that we're missing? Here he comes. Mr. Scalise votes aye.
Police votes aye.
Ms. DeVisi votes no.
Mr. Veazey votes no.
I think that's it for now. I don't think anybody else is coming right now. All right. So the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 23 and the nays were 30.
So the amendment, Ms. Shawn amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other further amendments? I think we have another one. Ms. McKinley.
I have an amendment at the desk. It's number 13.
Number 13, lucky 13.
Let's see how lucky it is.
I know. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. Blank offered by Mr. McKinley.
Without objection, the reading of the McKinley amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, one of my top priorities for pipeline safety reauthorization is to help PHMSA complete the remaining congressional mandates from these prior reauthorizations. There's little sense in piling more on PHMSA if it can't complete the work it has already been assigned. PHMSA has prioritized the most important rulemaking, major rules involving both gas and hazardous liquid pipelines. The agency is making good progress, but still has a lot of work to do. As Congressman Woman Eshoo has said, several mandates from the 2011 and 2016 laws still remain. There are important safety rulemakers that still need to get done, and we shouldn't distract PHMSA from these important tasks. This amendment would simply prioritize the completion of the outstanding regulations before beginning a new rulemaking, unless another rulemaking is required to address an imminent hazard to public health and safety or the environment. We can all agree that PHMSA should follow the law and complete the congressionally directed mandates. This amendment would simply ensure that PHMSA focuses on its tasks and completes these important safety regulations in a timely fashion. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlemen, yield back. I would recognize myself in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. I understand the gentleman's frustration of the slow pace of rulemaking, but Section 28 of the bill addresses the gentleman's concern, in my opinion. We're sympathetic to the gentleman's amendment. However, we have learned from our experience in that if we ask the agencies to spend time prioritizing rulemaking, then they never get to issuing important new protections like those found in the bill. So for that reason, I am opposed to the amendment and would urge my colleagues to vote against it. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do appreciate you bringing this bill today with respect to rulemaking. I am sorry to see that it's not bipartisan, but I also was pleased to see provisions that address climate change through mitigating fugitive methane emissions. And I would not want to slow that down. Methane is known as a superpollutant because it's 80 times more potent as a climate agent than CO2. It's also a short-lived climate pollutant because its atmospheric lifespan is much shorter than CO2. And these superpollutants can cause 25 to 2,000 times more warming per ton over a 25 to 100-year period. The good news is that reducing them could reduce the rate of warming during the next 30 years by about half. And this bill helps make that progress by ensuring an increased reliance on new technologies to detect and fix methane leaks. It also focuses on mitigating methane emissions by including a codification of the EPA's 2016 methane rule. That's language from a bill by Congresswoman DeGette, which I support. 2015, the EPA estimated that codifying this rule would have prevented 170 to 180,000 tons of methane, 120,000 tons of VOCs, and 310 to 400 tons of hazardous air pollutants. So that effort's related to my bill, the Superpollutants, Bipartisan Superpollutants Act, which also codifies the EPA methane rule for new sources. Additionally, it would regulate methane from existing sources if industry efforts don't increase methane emissions by 40% below 2012 levels. Colorado was the first state to directly regulate new and existing oil and gas wells. My home state of California followed some of the strongest provisions to regulate methane emissions from new and existing sources. But now is the time to regulate methane at the federal level, and the language of this bill is an important part of that effort. According to Dr. Ramanathan, the Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric and Climate Sciences at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego, cutting superpollutants is the fastest way to slow the pace of climate change. I urge my colleagues to heed this advice, to support the bill, and to decline this amendment, and I yield back.
Yes, Mr. Walden is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Strike the last word on the amendment and be in support of the amendment. I mean, folks, let's take a look at what this amendment does. It requires the Secretary of Transportation shall prioritize the completion of outstanding regulations before beginning a new rulemaking, unless the Secretary determines a new rulemaking is required to address an unsafe condition or practice, or a combination of unsafe conditions or practices that pose an imminent hazard to public health and safety of the environment. That's what this does. That's what it says. So if there are issues that are of imminent public health and safety, they could go ahead with a new rulemaking. But I'll tell you, I think we have all shared the frustration of agencies that never get around to complying with what we've enacted legislatively by finishing their rulemakings. And my friend from West Virginia is simply saying in this pretty straightforward amendment to the Department of Transportation, finish the rulemaking on valves, finish the rulemaking on public notice requirements, finish the rulemaking on gathering lines and whether and how to regulate them. These are things that we in a bipartisan way have told the agency to do year after year, and they haven't done it. And so I'm a little surprised that this amendment's running into a partisan wall here, because it's a pretty straightforward one that just says, do the job we've ordered you to do before you take on new stuff. And unless that new stuff deals with unsafe conditions or practices, imminent threats to hazard of public health or safety, and the bill that we're considering today does not override all of these other rulemaking directives from Congress. It's in addition to. And if we don't hold these agencies accountable and help them set their priorities and do it now, I don't know when we're going to do it. And I think the gentleman from West Virginia has a very strong amendment here, and I would encourage members of both sides of the aisle to support it. And if not, I think it speaks to the kind of difficulties we've run into trying to negotiate on this bill. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. Does anyone else want to speak on this? If not, we're going to pursue. Oh, Mr. McNerney is recognized for 5 minutes.
I think the chairman indicated that this amendment is covered by the underlying bill, Could I ask counsel to describe that section and what it does?
Section 28 requires definition of outstanding regulation. Then it provides a requirement for PHMSA to publish 30 days thereafter on its website an update to the status of each outstanding regulation and submit notifications to the committees of Energy and Commerce, Transportation and Infrastructure, and the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation of the Senate.
If the gentleman would yield, my concern is that the committee, if you look at the McKinley Amendment, it says the Secretary shall prioritize the completion of outstanding regulations before beginning a new rulemaking. And, the concern is that if we do this prioritization, they're never going to get to issuing important new protections like those found in the bill. That's our concern.
All right, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you. Does you want to speak, Mr. Bouchon? Recognized for 5 minutes?
And I yield to the ranking member.
I thank the gentleman, and I guess our point is that's great that in the bill you tell the agency, go to all this work, tell us what you're behind on. That's like telling your kid, what are you behind on your schoolwork, and never saying, you got to go get it done and turn it in. And what Mr. McKinley's amendment says is, identify what you haven't done that you're supposed to do and finish it. And so that's, I think, what we all should be for. We have these debates all the time, and usually we're shoulder to shoulder on them, telling agencies, do the work we told you to do and get it done. And yeah, there's a bit of a club here, but not if it gets against public safety or any of that. They can go ahead with new rulemakings. But we've got to double down on this so that the past legislation we've approved and it's become law that is trying to facilitate better public notice, facilitate rules on valves, do the things we all say we want done, gets done. This is like telling your kid, you got to actually do the homework and turn it in. That's what this amendment does. And so again, I would urge my colleagues to support it, and I'd yield back to Mr. Bouchon.
Mr. Bouchon, can I just ask you to yield to me for a minute? I mean, I understand, as I said, I'm sympathetic to the concern, but the problem is these agencies there's such a slow pace with the rulemaking that I think that this language that Mr. McKinley's proposing it very well might have the opposite effect and just slows it down even more. That's why I'm opposed to it.
Okay.
I yield back to the gentleman.
Yeah, I just want to say that had my amendment passed, then we wouldn't have all the lawsuits further delaying the rulemaking process, but it didn't pass. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else want to talk about this? Otherwise, going to move to a vote on the McKinley amendment. All right. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Oh, you want a recorded vote? Okay. Recorded vote is ordered on the McKinley amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Gett. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Mrs. Dingle? Mr. Vesey? Ms. Custer? Ms. Custer votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Berrigan? Ms. Berrigan votes no. Mr. McEachin? Mr. McEachin, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester? Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto, no. Mr. O'Halloran? Mr. O'Halloran, no. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta, aye. Mrs. Rogers? Mrs. Rogers, aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Johnson, sorry. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Long? Mr. Long, aye. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon, aye. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores, aye. Mrs. Brooks? Mrs. Brooks, aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg, aye. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan, aye. Mr. Giaforte? Mr. Giaforte, aye. Mr. Pallone?
Votes no.
Mr. Pallone votes no.
Members who haven't been recognized, Mr. Rush,
Rush votes no.
Mr. Rush votes no.
Mr. Schrader,
Mr. Schrader votes no.
Mr. Tonko,
Mr. Tonko votes no.
Ms. Castor,
Ms. Castor votes no.
Mr. Kennedy,
Mr. Kennedy, no.
Ms. DeGette,
Ms. DeGette, no.
Ms. Dingle,
Mrs. Dingle votes no.
Mr. Vesey,
Mr. Vesey, no.
Mr. Sarbanes.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
Anyone else on either side? We're waiting for Steve. He's not coming? Okay. Any? All right, we still have a couple that are almost here, so we'll wait. All right, we're not waiting any longer. The clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 22 and the nays were 28.
Thank you. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Johnson has an amendment. Does the clerk have it?
It's number 17.
Yes, sir, we have it.
The clerk will report the Johnson amendment.
Amendment to H.R. Blank offered by Mr. Johnson of Ohio, strike subsection A.
Without objection,
section
the
3.
reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I've mentioned before, we all want to produce a bill that truly enhances the safety of our pipeline network. And because of that shared goal, pipeline safety reauthorization has always been a significant bipartisan effort. I was optimistic that this hearing would be no different today, but I was unfortunately wrong. Instead of working with us on shared priorities, such as encouraging the successful integration of new technologies that can improve pipeline safety, or ensuring PHMSA and the states have the necessary resources and tools they need to carry out their responsibilities, we're left with an overly partisan bill that goes way beyond the scope of addressing pipeline safety. Mr. Chairman, my amendment is simple. It ensures PHMSA can continue to assess the cost and benefits of its pipeline safety rules. I worry that if PHMSA is unable to make this assessment within its rulemakings, we'll be left with incomplete rules that are not entirely workable for pipeline operators. That's very concerning, especially given that safer pipeline operations are the objective of these rules. Earlier this year, we heard witnesses express concerns about removing this requirement. Witnesses testified that PHMSA's cost-benefit requirement won't necessarily improve the speed of its rulemaking process, but could instead have the opposite effect. This assessment helps address technical feasibility concerns early in the rulemaking process, thereby negating any lengthy review issues when OMB performs its own analysis. Additionally, receiving input from other agencies and stakeholders only helps to provide for a rule that can more successfully address safety concerns and is cost effective. So I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment, and I yield back unless someone else would like to use the remainder of my time. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, and I recognize myself now in opposition to the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment, well, basically the bill, the underlying bill, strikes the cost-benefit analysis. Mr. Johnson's amendment is bringing it back. The problem with the cost-benefit analysis imposed on PHMSA is that it not only hamstrings the administration from carrying out its responsibility, as nearly all non-industry stakeholders agree, but it's uniquely onerous in that no other federal entity is subject to a similar standard. One past administrator said that this provision, that's the cost-benefit analysis, has contributed to the extreme delays in PHMSA's efforts to push out new rules. So this cost-benefit analysis review in current law, in my opinion, is at best duplicative of the review that OMB performs on all major rules. I actually believe that the cost-benefit review is a club that industry uses to beat PHMSA into issuing regulations that favor business and cost savings over the public good. And this is obvious in a recent letter that the two industry groups sent to PHMSA in opposition to the Gas Pipeline Advisory Committee's recommendation that the agency strengthen its regulation of gas gathering lines larger than 8 inches in diameter. In their letter, the two industry groups subtly threatened legal action to overturn the proposal if adopted by saying that the advisory committee doesn't adhere to the prescriptive cost-benefit analysis in the law. I think it's time for this rigged, duplicative cost-benefit language to go, or at least be rewritten in a way that tilts that balance towards keeping the public safe and away from the law's focus on protecting the safety of industry profits. So, because Mr. Johnson is seeking to bring the cost-benefit analysis back, I would urge my colleagues to reject his amendment. And unless anybody else, Mr. McNerney?
The chairman yields some time to me.
I yield to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any cost-benefit analysis imposed on PHMSA not only hamstrings the administration from carrying out its responsibility, and nearly all stakeholders agree with this, but is uniquely onerous that no other federal entity is subject to a similar duplicative standard. In other words, this provision is really a Trojan horse intended to weaken the law. I think I speak for all of my Democratic colleagues when I say that we are determined to remove this burdensome requirement and are open to working with our Republican colleagues, the administration, and other stakeholders to find a solution that will help improve the safety of our nation's pipelines. I yield back to the chair.
Thank you. So we're on the Johnson Amendment. Does anyone else want to talk about this? If not, you want to record a vote, Mr. Johnson?
Yes, Mr. Chairman,
Okay.
I request a recorded vote.
So we'll move to a recorded vote. It's ordered. Those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Those opposed to the Johnson Amendment will say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush? No. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Engel? Ms. DeGette? Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, no. Ms. Clark? Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack, no. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Kent, I'm sorry. Mr. Schrader votes no. Okay. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Cardenas, no. Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters, no. Mrs. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Vesey? Ms. Custer? Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Berrigan? Ms. Berrigan, no. Mr. McEachin? Ms. Blunt Rochester? Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto, no. Mr. O'Halloran? Mr. O'Halloran, no. Mr. Walden? Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta, aye. Mrs. Rogers? Mrs. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long? Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores, aye. Mrs. Brooks? Mrs. Brooks, aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson, aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg, aye. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan, aye. Mr. Giaforte? Mr. Giaforte, aye. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes no.
Sarbanes?
Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
Schrader?
Not, you're recorded as voting no, Mr. Schrader.
He wants to change it to yes.
Okay. Mr. Schrader is off of no and on aye.
Ms. DeGette?
Ms. DeGette votes no.
Mr. Kennedy, yeah.
Mr. Kennedy votes no. Ms. Clark?
Ms. Clark?
Ms. Clark votes no.
I don't think I'm recorded, Madam
No, you aren't.
Clerk.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
I vote no.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Mr. Walden?
Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Votes aye. Mr. Walden votes aye.
Anyone else who's not recorded? Or anyone else we're expecting? No? Hold on a second, let's see. Unless anyone else is expected, we'll call. The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 23 and the nays were 25.
So the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any? Did we get that right? Do you want to look at it again? I just asked you to repeat it, that's all.
Oh, okay. Mr. Chairman, the vote was 23 ayes and 25 nays.
Okay, so the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments? Democrat? Oh, you want to bring up the Latta amendment now?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Latta?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It appears that we couldn't get something worked out. The amendment that I've offered is about innovation and safety, and so at this time, I'd ask for a roll call vote on my amendment.
All right, so we weren't able to work this out, right? Okay. This is Latta 20. Do we have to repeat all this? Latta 19. Do we have to bring it up again since he withdrew it? Why don't we?
It was
All right.
withdrawn without prejudice, Mr. Chairman, so.
All right, why don't we bring it up then? The clerk will report the Latta amendment.
Amendment to H.R. Blank offered by Mr. Latta of Ohio, add at the end the followings.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Did you want to speak any more? No?
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I just call for the roll call.
All right, well, let me just, if I could just, before you do the roll call, let me just strike the last word and said that we tried to work this out where we couldn't, so I would urge members to vote no. And unless anyone else wants to speak, we'll move to a recorded vote. Recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush. Ms. Eschew. Ms. Eschew votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Gett. Mr. Gett votes no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Clark rather. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack, no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Veazey. Ms. Custer. Ms. Custer votes no. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Berrigan. Ms. Berrigan, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto, no. Mr. O'Halloran. Mr. O'Halloran, no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. Rogers. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long, aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon, aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores, aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks, aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson, aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Giaforte. Mr. Giaforte, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no.
Mr. Walden?
Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Walden votes aye.
Ms. Rogers?
Ms. Rogers votes aye.
Mr. McKinley?
Ms. McKinley votes aye.
Mr. Rush?
Mr. Rush votes no.
Sarbanes?
Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
Schakowsky?
Ms. Sikowski, no.
McEachin?
Mr. McEachin votes no.
Anybody else we missed on either side? Anybody still coming? Unless it looks like no one else is coming, so the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 23 and the nays were 26.
So the amendment is not agreed to. Do we have any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Ms. Rogers?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The late-
ECN 09.
Okay, see if the clerk has it.
We have it, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the Rogers amendment.
Amendment to H.R. Blank offered by Mrs. Rogers of Washington, strike Section 12
Without
of the bill.
objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and the gentlewoman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share my colleagues' disappointment that the majority has chosen to throw out months of negotiation and years of bipartisan history on pipeline safety, and instead put forward a bill that scores political points rather than gets results. When it comes to pipelines, this committee has been instrumental in developing a program that has increased the safety of the nation's pipeline system, and it's done it in a bipartisan fashion. Unfortunately, this partisan bill before us today contains many provisions that impose new requirements, rules, and penalties that will have a harmful consequence for pipeline safety. One provision that concerns me is changing the legal standard for criminal actions from knowingly and willfully to knowing or recklessly. While that standard may be appropriate for other transportation modes, such as transporting hazardous materials by truck, it is not the best fit for pipeline operators and will likely have unintended consequences. PHMSA has raised concerns and pointed out that the current standard has allowed DOJ to successfully pursue numerous pipeline safety-related prosecutions. The witnesses at the legislative hearing suggested that it could actually discourage pipeline operators from openly sharing information about incidences. While I agree we should hold criminals those that are negligent accountable, it's unclear what problem this provision is trying to fix. My amendment would simply strike this new unnecessary standard and keep it in place the current criminal liability standard that DOJ successfully utilizes. I urge adoption of my amendment and urge my friends in the majority to come back to the negotiating table. Let's work together to ensure pipeline infrastructure is safe for the benefit of all Americans. And I yield back.
I'll recognize myself very briefly in opposition to Mrs. Rogers' amendment. The problem that I see is that the underlying bill makes it a lot easier for us to go after those who were willfully, violating the law, causing problems, and she strikes that. And so I would ask members to vote in opposition to her amendment. Yes, Mr. Peters. Well, I yield you my time.
I just wondered if Mr. Schrader's previous amendment had dealt with this issue and had clarified it. I think it's different from what my colleague from Washington said already.
Did you want to comment? I'll yield to you, Mr. Schrader.
Yeah, I appreciate my colleague's concerns, and that was the reason I offered the amendment that this committee adopted unanimously earlier in the hearing. So I don't think this is actually necessary since we already
All
took
right.
care of it.
So he's basically saying it addresses the same concern. So again, I would ask you, take back my time and urge our members to vote against the gentlewoman's amendment. I yield back. Does anyone else want to speak on this? I was just going to have a voice vote unless you want a recorded vote.
I would request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is ordered. On the gentlewoman's amendment, those in favor of the Rogers amendment will say aye. Those opposed say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack, no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Veazey. Ms. Custer. Ms. Custer votes no. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Berrigan. Ms. Berrigan, no. Mr. McEachin. Mr. McEachin, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. O'Halloran. Mr. O'Halloran votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, aye. Mrs. Rogers. Mrs. Rogers, aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon, aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores, aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks, aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson, aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan, aye. Mr. Giaforte. Mr. Giaforte, aye. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Kelly votes no.
Do you have me recorded, Madam Clerk? I vote no.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else who's
votes
missing?
no.
Mr. Sarbanes?
Mr. Sarbanes not recorded.
Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes no.
Mullen?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Mullen, how are you? Votes aye.
Mr. Veazey?
Mr. Veazey votes no.
Mr. Kennedy?
He's recorded, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Butterfield?
No,
Is
sir.
he recorded?
No.
Votes no.
Oh, yeah, he is recorded.
Anyone else who's, Mr. Walden, is
Not
he?
recorded, Mr. Chairman.
Votes
Mr.
aye.
Walden votes aye.
Anyone else who's not recorded or who we're expecting?
Got you. You're good. Is anybody else here? We haven't gotten Cardenas? Where is he? He's not here.
Anyone else coming? If not, we're going to close the vote. All right. Can I ask the clerk to report the tally?
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 22 and the nays were 28.
So the Rogers Amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other further amendments to the legislation? Mr. Flores has an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to H.R. blank, it's amendment number 5.
The clerk have the amendment?
Yes, sir.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. blank offered by Mr. Flores of Texas.
Without objection, the reading of the Flores Amendment will be dispensed with, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment continues our approach to institute stronger safeguards related to attempts to damage pipeline infrastructure. This amendment states that any person that knowingly and willingly engages in unauthorized turning of a valve of a pipeline facility will be subject to fines and prison time. Mr. Chairman, this amendment specifies that it does not abridge an individual's right to protest as protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. We are strictly concerned with the safety of our pipelines, and in no way does this amendment bar anyone from peaceful protest. This amendment is about the safety of our pipeline infrastructure and the surrounding communities. Unauthorized turning of a pipeline can have dire consequences for communities, pipeline workers, the economy, and the environment. We've seen several examples of this sort of risk this behavior poses. In October 2016, anti-pipeline activists staged simultaneous attacks on 5 crude oil pipelines in 4 states along the border of the U.S. and Canada. These assailants targeted valve stations which have important specific uses to control the flow of product through the pipelines, such as isolating a pipeline segment during an emergency or in order to conduct maintenance. After breaking the chains and locks on perimeter fencing, assailants entered the facility grounds and turned the valves, shutting off the flow of pipelines that together had a delivery capacity of 2.8 million barrels of crude a day, or around 15% of daily U.S. consumption. We've seen similar attacks in 2017 against the same pipeline. In 2019, assailants attacked and damaged another pipeline in northern Minnesota. As you can see in the pictures displayed, this is an issue that Congress needs to act upon. The safety of our pipelines, the safety of our communities, and the environment are at risk if we continue to allow such behavior to continue. This is exactly the sort of behavior that a pipeline safety reauthorization bill should address. Pipeline turning activities are not peaceful. They are not protests protected by free speech. Rather, they are illicit and unauthorized behavior that can severely damage our pipeline infrastructure, injure persons, and damage the environment. The bottom line is terrorist activities are not free speech. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is a sensible safety provision. As you know, I offered and later withdrew a similar amendment in June during the subcommittee markup. Democratic leadership on the Energy Subcommittee promised to work with us on this issue to find a bipartisan solution. Unfortunately, the majority was abandoning a strong history of bipartisanship on pipeline safety. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Flores. Let me just explain what we're expecting is we're going to have a couple of voice votes in the committee, including on Mr. Flores' amendment, and then we expect votes on the floor before we vote on final passage of the bill. But we'll see, but that's what we're expecting right now. So Mr. Rush is recognized for 5 minutes on Mr. Flores' amendment. You want to, your mic is not on, is it? All right, we're going to accept this amendment, so unless anybody has any more to say, I'm going to go to a voice vote on the Flores amendment. All those in favor of the Flores amendment will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. We have another amendment, right?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr.
I have an amendment at the desk, and I'll be very brief. It's amendment number 16, cybersecurity.
Clerk will report the amendment if she has it.
Amendment to H.R. blank offered by Mr. Upton of Michigan at the end of the bill.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and Mr. Upton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will not take my 5 minutes. This is based on the bipartisan bill that I introduced earlier this year, H.R. 370, and I appreciate the majority working with us on this issue. The amendments would authorize the Department of Energy to carry out a program to strengthen the physical and cybersecurity of pipelines and LNG facilities by establishing policies and procedures to coordinate federal agencies, the states, and the energy sector to ensure the resilience of our energy systems. The amendment would also encourage DOE and the energy industry to coordinate response and recovery efforts. It's a very good amendment. I'm told that we can accept this by voice as part of this bill, and I would urge all my colleagues to vote for it and yield back my time.
Does anyone else want to speak on this amendment? Otherwise, going to go to a voice vote. All those in favor of the Upton amendment will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Upton amendment is agreed to. Now, do we have any other amendments, or we're done? Okay. We're going to move to final passage since there are no votes on the floor yet. Okay? Okay, you want a recorded vote on final, I assume, correct? Okay. Okay, so now we're done with the amendments. We're on final passage of the underlying pipeline safety bill, the Rush bill. The question now occurs on favorably reporting the bill as amended to the full House. And we are going to have a recorded vote that's ordered. Recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of reporting the bill to the full House will say aye. Those opposed will say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush?
Aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel? Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko, aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader, aye. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mrs. Dingle? Ms. Dingle votes aye. Ms. Vesey? Ms. Custer? Ms. Custer votes aye. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Berrigan? Ms. Berrigan, aye. Mr. McNerney? I'm sorry. Mr. McEachin, sorry. Mr. McEachin? Mr. McEachin votes aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester? Ms. Blunt Rochester, aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto, aye. Mr. O'Halloran? Mr. O'Halloran, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, no. Mrs. Rogers. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes yes. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long, no. Mr. Bouchon. No. Mr. Bouchon, no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores, no. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks, no. Mr. Mullen. No. Mr. Mullen, no. Mr. Hudson. No. Mr. Hudson, no. Mr. Wahlberg. Wahlberg, no. Mr. Carter. No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Duncan. No. Mr. Duncan, no. Mr. Giaforte. Mr. Giaforte, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye.
Other members? Mr. Peters.
Mr. Peters votes
Mr.
aye.
Sarbanes.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Veazey. Mr.
Mr. Veazey
Kinzinger.
votes aye.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Mr. Kinzinger votes no. No.
Mrs. Rogers.
Mrs. Roger votes no.
Anyone else who's not recorded? Or who we're expecting? Are we waiting for anyone else? We're not waiting for any, huh?
Cardenas is on his way, but do we need him?
No, but that's not the issue. I mean, I guess there are a couple of members still on their way. I mean, we don't have the vote yet, so we could wait a minute. Well, just wait a minute and see who else shows up, and if not, we'll call the roll and we'll recess. Just so you know, what we're going to do after this is done, we're going to recess because we're expecting a vote on the floor. We're supposed to be at 1 o'clock, but here's Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas, how do you vote? Votes aye. All right. So,
Mr. Cardenas votes aye.
anyone else that we missed? Okay. Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, final passage, the yeas were 30 and the nays were 21.
Okay, so the ayes have it, and the bill is reported to the full House. Now, what we're going to do is recess. There's supposed to be a vote, and I don't really want to start the next bill since there's supposed to be a vote. Oh, they just called the vote. Okay. So I don't know how many there are, but what we're asking everybody is to come back after this series is done, okay? And then we'll continue and move to the next bill after this series. There are only 2 votes, so it shouldn't take too long. So with that, the committee stands in recess.